All right, welcome everyone to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. Joining us today is Natasha Helfer. And if you're a therapist, chances are that you have worked with clients who have sexual trauma, religious trauma, and maybe we're not sure what the exact interventions are most efficacious in working with this population. So this is why I'm excited to have Natasha on today. She is a certified sex therapist and expert in religious trauma, and she's here to help us with that intersection and dealing with clients who may be going through a transition in their faith or trying to deal with negotiating some of the sexual shame or religious issues with containment or internal conflict and all the stuff that comes in working with these populations. So, very happy to have you on. Thank you so much, Natasha. Do you want to share with us a little bit about your background and what we
Sure.
can learn about this fascinating topic?
Yeah. Hi. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm also certified as a sex therapist through AASECT. So it's kind of a bit of my professional background. Personally, I come from a background in Mormonism myself. I was raised in the Mormon faith, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I also have quite a bit of experience working with evangelical folks, Bible Belt folks. I lived quite a bit of my adult life in Wichita, Kansas. And I'm also Latina, so I speak Spanish fluently. So I've worked with a lot of Hispanic Catholics. So I've had a lot of religious folks come through my practice throughout my career, and this topic has come up more and more. We are seeing more people leave religious organizations than ever before. That's kind of across the board. And so that does relate to people's identity work, mental health work, community issues, all kinds of things. So it is a topic that's dear to my heart for sure.
All right. I had a little bit of an echo there. Streaming to Instagram for the first time, so bear with me. Natasha,
Okay.
there we go. We're all better now.
Okay,
Thank you
good.
so much. So thank you so much for having making time today. I just had to mute the browser on Instagram. You learn as you go, folks. You learn as you go. So as I'd mentioned before we jumped on in the chat, anyone who's joining from Instagram, please be aware I am trying to monitor the comments over there. Appreciate you being here. StreamYard has not yet integrated comments with Instagram, so if you want to join the conversation in the chat, highlight your questions for Natasha, please do make sure you jump on the YouTube channel or via Facebook. Just give Facebook permission to show your chat, and we'll be all good. Natasha, do you prefer saving the questions for the end, or do you just want to play as we go if we have any questions along the
I'm
way?
I'm open to your flow, whatever you'd like, whatever's more comfortable for you.
Excellent. Super. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for being on. Again, my apologies for the echo on my end. Did you hear an echo on your end?
I did not hear an
No,
echo,
good.
just so you know.
Okay, just me. Okay,
I know that
cool.
matters sometimes.
Very good. All right, so as we get rolling here, do you want to share a little bit about your work in this field as a sex therapist, also in the religious trauma background, and how you got into this specific work? Because that is quite the intersection.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think I got into the work kind of naturally, having been part of a religious community myself, as it is with a lot of counselors. People will come to you because you're part of their religious community, right? And we know through the research that people from religious backgrounds tend to favor therapists who also come from their religious backgrounds. Now, there's pros and cons to that for a lot of different reasons. So that was definitely my experience. And as people came and were starting to work with me, there were just so many issues along the way. I mean, I've been in this field for almost 30 years now. So I started kind of before the internet was a big deal, before there was a lot of internet pornography, for example. So that was kind of
Hmm.
like the first flow of things that would start coming in with a lot of issues and concerns and ideas about whether or not there was such a thing as sex addiction, which now we know that there are much better ways of formatting um, sexual healthness outside of an addictions model. But those were things I did not know at the time, and I was trying to find information about. And then you had kind of a flow of mixed faith marriages, right? Because if one person leaves a religion, that doesn't necessarily mean their spouse leaves the religion. So
Hmm.
that can cause a lot of distress and conversations and worry and anxiety. And then we also have had a huge shift in our nation as far as LGBTQ rights over the last 30 years. And so lots of people who are going through a coming out process also come from religious backgrounds themselves, and they're trying to figure out, what does that mean for my spirituality? What does that mean for my religious community and my participation? Am I not accepted or loved by God or by my people? Am I going to be ostracized because if I come out as gay or trans, I'm going to be seen as a sinner or something along
Hmm.
those lines? So that was a huge influx of people. And then as I've worked with people who have left their religious homes and doing, in particular, sexual identity work, boy,
Hmm.
there's so much. So many of these people were raised in environments where even the act of touching yourself, masturbation, any type of self-exploration or self-fantasy, in your mind would be considered a sinful behavior. So when you've been raised in that kind of restrictive space, it's very hard to know, where do I go from here? What do I believe now? What are my morals? What are my ethics? What's my sexual intelligence going to look like moving forward?
I imagine too that's because so much of our identity is embedded in our faith, right? A lot of the times they almost indistinguishable, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's true of all aspects of culture, and religion is one aspect of culture where you're going to be raised in a system, whether it's race or religion or ethnicity, and you're going to absorb all of that meaning of life that community has to offer you. And in a religious framework, that's usually like answering questions like, why am I here on earth? What's life about? Why do people suffer? What happens after we die? How am I supposed to live? What does God want for me in my life? So that's pretty much all encompassing when it comes to somebody's identity. And that affects, of course, your mental health, your social health, your sexual health, your spiritual health. And for some, that bodes really well. I mean, we have a lot of research showing that folks from different religious communities do well in all of those areas. And then for others, not so much. And then not all religion is the same, right? So you have
Right.
very fundamental religions, you have strict and conservative religions, you might have more progressive and liberal religions. For example, there's quite a few congregations that are very LGBTQ affirming, but there's
Hmm.
many religions that are not. So religion in of itself is,
Right.
is a large word that you have
Well,
to
even denominations within a religion,
Mhm.
right? Because
Right, exactly.
even the Christian faith, you can have very orthodox beliefs and doctrine, and you can have like the more, like you said, accepting sects of Christianity. Is it the same with other religions? I know you're very familiar with Latter-day Saints, Mormonism, the Mormon Church. I know some other faiths as well, such as Jehovah's Witness, have very strict beliefs. What do you find that each religion has its some leniency, or are some very just rigid across the board?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We have obviously religions kind of as, a monolith, which they're not.
Right.
But they have their kind of general beliefs, and you have some religions that do have different sects. Like you have Orthodox Judaism, you have New Age Judaism, right? And so even though it's all Judaism, it's very different as far as maybe what would be some of the standards or expectations that a person should live by. In Christianity, we've got like Unitarianism, we've got even within the Baptist church, you might have congregations that are more strict than others. Same with the
Hmm.
Lutherans and Methodists. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have, as far as the mainstream church, it's considered a strict religion, but there are offshoots from the mainstream church, like the fundamental Mormons and even more lenient, community of Christ that would be more affirming. But then you have fundamental Mormonism that's even probably more strict than the mainstream church. So yes, this is, I think, one of the important things even for therapists to consider is that when somebody comes in and tells you, well, I'm Catholic, right? Or I'm
Hmm.
Seventh-day Adventist, you may have your own perceptions of what that means, but within the religion, there are different families, there are different individuals I say there's 3 levels of assessment: the religion, the family that's living that religion, and then the individual that's part of that family. Because even in a family, you can have a family that's quite progressive within a certain congregation, but one of the kids that comes out of that family trends more orthodox, right? And so you just can't make a lot of assumptions. And assessment is really important.
Just
Um,
for those, I mean, even for myself, so I can take a quick note here. You were saying there, what are the three levels of assessment when we're looking at the religious background of a client?
yeah, so looking at the religion itself, where
Mm-hmm.
does it land on the spectrum of, flexibility?
Mm-hmm.
Where does it have like a tension with the wider culture?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I get this from Acts of Faith, written by Stark and Fink, which they talked about ultra liberal to ultra strict. And they kind of came up with 6 different categories. And it wasn't based on doctrine per se, it was based on what are the expectations that a person is supposed to meet in order to be considered part of that community.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, for example, Catholics and Mormons both believe that you shouldn't have premarital sex,
Mm-hmm.
but Mormons are actually more strict and will take more punitive measures if you don't adhere to those standards than maybe the Catholic community would. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the difference that they were trying to sort out. Um, and so that's the first thing is you have to think, okay, well, where's this religion kind of on that spectrum of degrees
Mm-hmm.
with tension with the wider culture? And then if you're the client in front of you comes from a family, how were they raised, right? Was that a
Mm-hmm.
very orthodox family? Did they take everything very seriously? Or they're the kind of family that only went to church once, on the holidays, right? They're like a less adherent family
Mm-hmm.
system. And then what about the individual in front of you? How did they respond on that level of flexibility to their religious community as well?
So we're looking at self, family, and kind of culture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating because I know when we're going through assessments, at the top of my assessments, I will usually have religion as the first thing, following obviously the referral and all that, why clients come into the office in the first place, why seeking mental health. But religion is one of those things that's quick and easy to drive by. And you might ask what somebody's faith is or the religion. They might say, "Oh, I'm Christian," or I'll usually go a little deep, say, "Do you have a home church?" But then a lot of times, just like any assessment, you never know what is going to be relevant. There's, I think, sometimes there's the temptation to drive past things pretty quick, but then it might not come up in the religion topic as we're asking questions. It might come up when we're talking about family. And somebody, oh, I was raised in a such and such religious home and they were very strict. And that might lead to other things when you start talking about social and relationships. And you're like, oh, my boyfriend. Well, then if you're connecting the dots, then you might circle back to religion and say, is there a conflict here?
Mhm,
Right.
mhm.
And so we have to be looking at all of these aspects of the self and how clients relate to society and what their faith, what role that may play
Yeah.
in terms of internal conflict, right? Value
Yeah, and this
systems.
is an area where we really kind of falter a bit as a field. I know in 2015, the Psychiatric Association came out with a position statement saying, look, religion is a form of diversity. And as far as cultural competence and training, we need to be trained in how to work with this topic. And yet most training centers do not really include much training on religion at all. I mean, it's kind of lumped into cultural and diversity training.
Hmm.
We get a lot more training on ethnicity and race and, minorities and that sort, but not so much. I mean, we mention religion, but religion is so vast, and most psychotherapists and counselors just don't really know how to address these issues in a way that maybe won't come across as offensive or dismissive or minimizing. We trend as a
Hmm.
profession to be non-religious, and so then
Hmm.
secular therapists a lot of times will not know how to bring up religion or how to even understand the import that it might have for some people. For example, a common complaint I get from a faith transitioner is they went to a therapist and the therapist says something like, well, yeah, why don't you find a church that you feel better about, right? Or not really understanding the cost of what it means to leave one's own religious community and how the community may be reacting to that. So we don't have the training. We Oh, and then the other problem too is that those of us who are religious and are therapists, sometimes we struggle too with ethics and boundaries and, treating people in a way where we're not imposing our own religious bias onto our clients. So it's
Ah,
kind of
yes.
messy
It's
either
always
way,
tricky, right?
right?
Countertransference, right, is what we're talking about.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And this is why training is so important. And I'll just put in a plug right here, but I'm developing this program called learnreligiontherapy.com. And
Ah.
it's really based on CEs for therapists to know how to work with religiously conservative folks, with LGBTQ folks coming out of religion, with
Mhm.
parents of LGBTQ minors who don't really know how to be affirming. Just so many things, faith transitions, religious trauma. So if you're interested in that, definitely check me out there.
For sure. Definitely. We'll put that up in the show notes. I want to learn more about that. And much to your point, like I sometimes will make assumptions about another religion, or if I don't understand a lot about it, sometimes I'll not do the extra work to ask all the questions to better understand, which makes me wonder, because I want to be a better therapist. What what are some assessment questions that you have found to be really useful when we are trying to understand a client's religious background or belief system? Something
Yeah,
that kind of
that's a
get us to
great.
the third layer, quicker,
Yeah,
right?
right. And just so you know, if you go to this website, learnreligiontherapy.com, and sign up for my email list, you actually get a free ecosystemic assessment questionnaire
Oh, I
that
like
I've
it.
come up with that will help you with all these questions that I think are useful anyway. So, but
Give us
yeah,
the name
I
of that
think
one more time, the site.
learnreligiontherapy.com. And if you sign up for the email, yeah, you'll get that free assessment tool.
Awesome. There you go,
Um,
everybody. Value already, and we're only
yeah, I hope
20 minutes in.
so.
Look
I'm
at
all
that.
about value. And I'm like you, I'm always trying to be better at what we do, right? Which is
That's
hard.
right.
But yeah, I think first of all, the research shows that people just want to be asked about their religion and spirituality, much like sexuality. It's a topic that's kind of personal, and people wonder if the therapist might have some, I don't know, like some misgivings or some
Hmm.
bias against religion. So a lot of people won't bring it up to their therapist, just like they won't bring up sexuality because they're not sure
Hmm.
it's safe. They're not sure they'll offend the therapist. It's always kind of classic when a client is trying to protect us, right? When
Yes, right,
that's not
right.
their job. So,
Well, too, I think a lot
with
of clients are
people,
used to
yeah,
having to be cautious, right, with what they
yeah,
self-disclose to other people. So if it's their first time in therapy too, they may not understand that it's ideally a judgment-free zone,
right,
right?
right. So the research shows that they want us to ask about it. And so you can just say, hey, I notice here on my intake form, like you said, it's good to have it on your intake form. That you mentioned that you come from a Methodist background. Tell me a little bit about that. How important is your religious life currently? What type of religious upbringing did you have? Do you feel like on the spectrum of, very orthodox and conservative to more flexible? How do you think your parents did? What kinds of messages did you receive? What messages did you receive about God? Was this, like an all-loving type of entity or kind of more of a disciplinary type of entity? And I think that's really important to do, even if you share the same religion with your clients, because a lot of times when you share the same religion, people will assume that you have the same ideas that you do. So I'll usually say, for example, well, tell me about your Latter-day Saint God, because even though I'm Latter-day Saint, that doesn't
Hmm.
mean that we have the same perspective of who
A
God
great
is.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So being careful to not make assumptions.
Yeah. And then also
Yeah.
asking like what their current involvement is. Do they currently go to church? Why or why not? Are they going through any type of transition or shifts in their beliefs? If so, how has their community, have they respected that and supported that? Or have they gone kind of silent or have they even gone kind of punitive with them? Um, what forms of worship are helpful for them? Do they find prayer helpful, scripture reading, fasting? There's lots of kind of religious practices that people will engage in, and some people find those like tedious and like I just do
Hmm.
them because I'm supposed to do them.
Hmm.
I feel guilty if I don't, and other people find them very therapeutic. For
Right.
some people, prayer and meditation can be part of their mental health.
And I think that when I'm assessing that's usually the angle I'm coming from, is a strength-based perspective. I think of faith as a support system. I think if some person has faith or a faith background, that's something we can use to shore up the treatment, right? As an opportunity. But something I don't typically consider is the antithesis. What if they had a traumatic experience
Mhm.
with their religious sect, which or their family or their support system, and now they're kind of reeling from that? Because that's a loss. Right? That can be a big loss. That can be a lot, cause a lot of
Exactly.
problems. Um, which causes me to think, since this is your wheelhouse, right? What what are some of the common experiences you come across when it comes to religious trauma or sexual shame and that whole intersection? Like, what are some of the patterns you've noticed?
Yeah. Well, sometimes the trauma can happen just within the community as far as traumatic experiences, like clergy abuse, clergy
Mm-hmm.
sexual abuse. I mean, the Catholic Church, of course, had a huge scandal around this, but I don't know any church community that doesn't have some level of sexual abuse that's happening within. Um, and so, even if a person still has a testimony or a belief in their tradition, but they experienced this abuse within the church community, that can be very confusing. How would God, for example, allow this thing to happen, by my pastor or my bishop or my priest, and that can be very confusing and cause some cognitive dissonance and worry and frustration. And then they're returning to this place of worship where they have some of those triggers and they may need help addressing that. But they still want to be involved. They still believe. They still find the community as a whole very helpful. So that's one type of religious trauma. The other type of religious trauma is when people eventually get to the point where they feel like the religious teachings in of themselves that they feel now indoctrinated by were harmful to them, right? And when you think
Mm-hmm.
about some of these more strict religions, they can be very incisive about telling you that they are the one and right way. There is no other way that is correct. So already it's like if you have any questions or doubts, those are not really supported. You're supposed to, like in my church, they have this like doubt your doubts, like like don't pay attention to your doubts, right? Which is not really a form of critical thinking skills or things like that. Um, a lot of times these more conservative or fundamental churches will tell you a lot about your identity, who you are, why you're here, where you're going, how you're supposed to be. And they tend to be very heteronormative and very kind of idealistic to, um, you know, get married, have children, live a chaste life, live, within our ideas. And there can be a lot of messaging even that came from, oh, I forget now his name, but it was a Catholic priest back, I think, in the 1400s, where they really started talking about this, the natural man, right?
Mm-hmm.
The natural man, which is kind of this idea that you have these drives and these temptations and these things within you that are going to lead you towards gluttony and, distress and not being able to be in balance with your life. And so a lot of people feel like, boy, I wasn't even taught to trust myself or to trust my own instincts
Mm-hmm.
or to trust my own self. That self-consciousness, because I was already being told, no, if it differs from anything that I'm being told, I'm not supposed to trust myself. So that can feel traumatic, right? And then a lot of people were taught kind of scary things like, you have this God who can always see you. You've got this
Mm-hmm.
Satan who knows how to get into your mind and knows how to tempt
Mm-hmm.
you and knows how to, wants to take you over. And the demons are out there to try to get you. And if you don't conform, you're going to hell and,
Yeah.
and you're going to lose everything if you don't do, if you don't remain worthy or righteous or whatever language some of these religions can have. And so that can leave this kind of fear based, kind of undermining feeling. And then, of course, a lot of that is tied to sexuality. Don't touch your own body, don't have sexual thoughts, don't lust, don't, only have, sex in very conforming spaces, like heterosexually in marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Anything outside of that is bad. And even people who do fall into like a heterosexual format where they would want to marry a person in the church, they often tell me, it's not like I could just turn the on switch back. It's like I was told
Mm-hmm.
sex was bad and evil and dirty and perverse, and then all of a sudden I did get married, but it wasn't like I could just be like, oh great, now I can have great sex. There was still a lot of that fear-based energy that was there. So that's the kind of religious trauma that people oftentimes feel like they were traumatized by the teachings themselves.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah,
I think about, compartmentalization, right? The more
yeah,
we have to compartmentalize ourselves and our understandings and great contingencies about our behavior, like you said, especially if it's opposed to maybe what would come natural or trusting our own instincts, it can create sometimes quite an internal conflict for people, right? When it's so polarized,
yes,
you know. And that's not to say any religion is right or wrong or good or bad, but it's more about the human condition, right? How our psychology works, right? When we have alignment with our values, when we live in congruence with our values, and then we are acting in the way in which we intend to act and do the things in which we intend to do, then we have good mental health,
yeah,
right? When we're
right,
living a life that is in friction with our values or at odds with our beliefs about ourselves, right? Or our intentions, if our actions are not in line with our intentions, then we have all kinds of stress, conflict. We have somatic symptoms that arise, right? Especially in light of trauma. We don't make the best decisions under
yeah.
that mindset, right?
Yeah, especially when you feel like you have to hide a certain aspect of yourself. This
Mm-hmm.
is, when you're talking about values, I immediately think, well, for people in some of these communities, they're not really allowed to develop their own values. They're given their values, right? These are the values. These are the
Mm-hmm.
values that God has for you. And we as a community are going to make sure that you live this way. And so then now you've got this conflict of like your community religious values that are being imposed upon you. And some of those may resonate, and some of them may not because you have your own values, but they're not being encouraged to be developed, right?
Mm.
Then you have that tension that you may be adhering to values that you think you have, but they're, like a gay person, for example, who's praying the gay away, that's very common
Mm-hmm.
in these communities. They may think, well, I'm feeling good because I'm praying, and this is in coherence with my values, right? Because I'm not supposed to be gay, and I'm praying, I'm getting closer to God, and I'm kind of becoming scrupulous and OCD. And for a while, they may feel actually like you're saying good because they're doing the right thing. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's this other aspect of them that is more their general sense of being that has different values.
Mm-hmm.
The value of self-expression, the value of self-orientation and sexual identity. And so there's this side of them that's fighting this other part of them. And that's where that cognitive dissonance starts happening, usually at some point in their lives. And that can cause tremendous distress. And like you're saying, when these things don't align, it affects mental health symptoms. But we now know that it affects physical health symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
autoimmunity and digestion and chronic stress and heart attacks. And it's
Yeah,
like,
even
these
relationships
things
and
really,
relationship
and then
choices. I mean, it's
relationship
all
distress,
connected.
right? Relationship
Yeah.
distress. And there's a lot of people, for example, in mixed orientation marriages in these communities because there was so much pressure to marry heterosexually, even if that wasn't your identity. You weren't really allowed to have a sexual identity outside of
Mm-hmm.
heterosexuality. And so then they'll marry and again try to do these right things, but 10, 20, 30 years later, that may not be working anymore. And then that causes immense
Sure.
distress.
Sure.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the therapists out there, myself included, have worked with clients, and sometimes the deviance to the prescribed value system is a few degrees, right? And sometimes it's very polarized, right?
Mhm.
Or even taboo,
Mhm.
which begs the question, when somebody is wanting to live in accordance with their spiritual beliefs, they believe in a higher power, they believe in a God or what have you, and they want to live a life in accordance to these things. But the the ante in which the cost, right? The pay to play, the barrier to entry
Hmm.
requires something other than their default, right? Or
Right.
whatever you want to call it, their personality, their temperament, their sexuality. How, as therapists, what interventions can we utilize or try and implement to help clients have more of an alignment? Because otherwise, oftentimes, what I've seen with clients is they will try to be the good Christian, or they will try to be the good X, Y, or Z, and like you said, repress the self. But then oftentimes it manifests anyway, and then there's a lot of this shame and guilt and frustration, and then that actually does a lot of unnecessary damage to their mental health because they don't know how to negotiate this thing, right?
Right. Right.
Which and yet they want to belong, they want to be a part of, they want to be accepted, they want their fellowship, or they want to feel like they're living out their faith. What? Because this is tricky stuff, right? And it's a whole spectrum.
Yes.
And I find myself scratching my head with clients, a lot of the time and thinking like, what? Because it's such a personal thing, how they define their faith. You can't tell somebody how to prescribe their faith, oh, you can just, focus on this part of your religion and try not to worry about the rest. Because that's tricky because it is so unique to them, right?
Right. Right.
And what I do find a lot of the time happening is they will oftentimes, make a hard and fast choice, and if it's not deny themselves their sexuality or other parts of their being, then they'll deny themselves their spiritual need.
Right, because they're kind of pitted against one or
Right.
the other, right? They're
Right.
a lot of times that's what the religion is saying. You either choose God or you choose, the world, which is all these things, which now, of course, we know are just part of sexual diversity. I mean, anything like BDSM, non-monogamy, um,
Hmm.
sexual orientation, gender identity, like so many of these things are just part of the human diversity, how we show up, right? They're not necessarily things people are choosing, right? They're things that are part of our erotic templates for reasons that are very complex, and very um interesting and as far as understanding why our sexuality develops in certain ways, but most people don't choose what turns them on. It's just
Hmm.
it just kind of develops over time. So I think this is another area where it's important to do some assessment, because not only are you assessing the religion and the family and kind of the system they come from, you want to assess kind of where they are now, right? So
Hmm.
are they still, like you're saying, a believer and they're trying to get mental health help, but you as a therapist are seeing how maybe some of their religious worship or ideas are maybe interfering with some of what we might consider mental health practices, right? Like
Hmm.
self-determination, for example. And that's probably the trickiest,
Hmm.
group to work with, because we're wanting to meet them where they're at and respect their religious values. And we're seeing kind of some of these dilemmas that are coming up for them. Then you might have people who are questioning. They're still in. I like you're saying they already may be pretty good at kind of cafeterian to taking a
I like that.
cafeteria
Yeah.
approach, right, to
Right.
their religion. Like, I really love this about my church and my religion. I mean, how many Catholics have I worked with, for example, who don't use, who do use birth control?
Hmm.
That goes against their, I guess, religious doctrine, but they're like, like I'm okay with that, but I still believe in God and I still have my community and I still, love my Catholic tradition and beliefs. And then you have people who are actively leaving their faith or have left their faith. And they may be one, they may not even care too much about their faith. But since we're talking about religious trauma, usually the post people I'm talking about are the ones who are very angry and upset and going through a really pretty tremendous grief process,
Yeah.
right? Of
Burnt.
something that they've
Yeah.
lost. So depending on where your client is, will depend maybe some of the interventions or strategies that you want to develop, or your treatment planning, right, around some of these issues. So with the first case that you talked about, when there's some of these, they're still wanting to belong to their community, but you're noticing some things. I think this is challenging. And I think the first part that we have to do as therapists is be good listeners and be good joiners. Like that's the first intervention, is
Hmm.
really joining with your client, not challenging. I mean, I've usually lost, rightfully so, clients when I say something on session one, like, well, I don't think masturbation's a sin. And they're like, well, I'm out of here.
Hmm.
And I'm like, you know what? I think that was microaggressive on my part. I think they shared with me a belief that they had, and I discounted it. And I said,
Right.
well, I don't have that same belief. And that wasn't helpful, not, to the therapeutic process. So those are mistakes I've made along the way that I've learned. I can't just impose my beliefs. And in fact, that's another thing I would really recommend is never, hardly ever use the I as a therapist. Like, I don't believe
Hmm.
that's true, or I don't believe in that type of a God. Um, or, even if you do believe in God, to say, well, to even just imply that there's a God. Like, I went to a therapist with one of my kiddos who was struggling with anxiety, and the therapist said, well, I don't think God would want you to feel that way, without ever asking us, first of all, did we even believe in God? Was he talking to a deist family? I don't know.
Mm.
We could have been atheists for all he knew, but he was
Hmm.
imposing his beliefs about God. And then he's telling us how his God functions, where that may not be our God. Maybe his God doesn't want him to have anxiety, but who knows about our God? So,
Right. Right.
our God may see that as a perfectly, I don't know, functional trial and tribulation to go through in this world.
Hmm.
So you just can't make, so I think stay away from I think a lot of times what I try to do now is just say, well, here's a dilemma I see. On the one hand, you have this really tender belief, this really important belief. And in the social science fields, through research, we know this, right? This is kind of something that we found out about humans. Oh, what are
Yeah.
what are we going to
Right.
do with that dilemma? Right. So I'm just putting information on the table. I'm not saying you have to
Hmm.
choose this or you have to
I
choose that.
see.
I'm just saying,
You're
wow,
acknowledging the
this is a
conflict.
dilemma that you're really facing. Let's
Yeah.
talk about this. Mhm.
And we know that's where the healing actually takes place. Is
Right.
addressing the pink elephant, right?
And you're
Is
offering some psychoeducation because
hmm.
sometimes they don't know that thing that you're bringing up from the research, but you're also offering them the respect for self-determination in your
Hmm.
office, at least, for what they're
Sure.
going to think.
A breathing space, right? Because when we think about polarized environments, especially religious ones that are at conflict with the self, right? There's oftentimes not a safe space to breathe, let your mind breathe and put your thoughts out there and ask the questions and have a sounding board where you can really just explore what you even believe or think about the situation. Because oftentimes, going back to that compartmentalization, there's so much containment in these environments and these dynamics that clients often, will get in the habit of avoiding.
Mhm.
Whenever this conflict arises within themselves, they just,
Yeah.
push it away.
Right.
And that's
Right.
also what leads to some other, unhealthy behaviors, right?
Right.
Substance abuse, impulsive decisions because they're acting out of emotion from repressing a lot of the
Right.
times,
Yeah.
right?
Suppression is never a really healthy way to go. So even educating people about that, are you noticing, stomach aches? Are you noticing panic attacks? Are you noticing yourself moving towards behaviors that, don't necessarily um, are out of balance with your life? Like, there's
Hmm.
a difference between having a drink every now and then or being substance dependent,
Right.
right? Or even behaviors, like gaming or watching TV. I mean, there's ways to do that are super healthy and actually part of rest and leisure. And there's ways to do those things that are just kind of numbing because you're having such a hard time with
Hmm.
focusing on, facing some of these issues in your life. And so um, that can be another like I'm noticing that there's a lot of ways that you numb or that you hide or that you can't be honest with people in your life. And I wonder what toll that's taking on you, in order to adhere to this kind of religious expectation, and what is that like
Sure.
for you? Um, I think it's also, I think another strategy you can use is oftentimes permission giving. And I think that this is something that is you can do just by sharing information about the community. Like, for example, I work with quite a few non-monogamous folks, and I was working with some couples where, at least one of the persons in that partnership was still attending their church. And they were like, well, geez, that would be so hypocritical if I entered the lifestyle and still went to church. I have to choose. And so then I'll just say, well, just so you know, I know many people in your church community. There are many people in your church community who actually balance that, having both, not necessarily openly to their community, but they
Hmm.
keep that part private, and they do enjoy their church membership and fellowship, and they also participate in the lifestyle. That's all I say. I don't say I think you should do that. I don't think it's something you should consider. I'm just like, just so you know, there are people who do
Hmm.
this
Come
in
down
your
normalizing, right?
community.
Yeah, that there, it is one way of living, one way of being.
Right.
Right.
So it just gives this permission, like, and it can be as simple as masturbation, right? Like, oh, by the way, I know people in the Latter-day Saint community who masturbate and still go to the temple.
Hmm.
Like, that's actually not that uncommon. And that's
Hmm.
all I'll say. And then and so it has them thinking, huh, it kind of forces them to see themselves, because so many of these things are happening in isolation. It's like they're not talking to their community members about it.
Hmm.
And even if they did, nobody's admitting anything. So there's a lot of feeling of isolation and secrecy, and I'm alone, and I must be the only person who's
Hmm.
dealing with this issue. But so when I say something like that, as a therapist, I've worked with many people like you facing the same dilemma, and
Hmm.
they have chosen kind of a more hybrid approach that plants a seed for them of permission. Like, huh, maybe I could do that too. They may not, but I'm just letting that information sit there.
Right, and I think that does a lot, because everyone assumes they're the only one that is walking around with a sense of stigma,
Right.
right? And so when it can be normalized to some extent, and people know they're not alone, then it at least opens up the conversation, even with the self, right? To say, oh,
Exactly.
okay, because then again, it's not so polarized.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting because you, me, all of the other therapists joining us today or who watch this replay, we have this special position. I'm very honored and privileged to have this position, but we're privileged to people's, skeletons.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're the only person
Right.
privileged to those
Right.
skeletons.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the reasons therapy is so impactful, is because it gives people a breathing room where they can exhale a little bit and talk about, you know, why they've been keeping the skeleton in the closet in the first place. Maybe it's not even a skeleton. They just thought it was, and so it's such a powerful outlet to have, for everyone to realize that they're not siloed.
Right.
They don't have to be siloed with these
Right.
things. And not to say that, everyone should walk around self-disclosing everything, because that's not safe either, right? Not everybody's understanding, and there can be complex trauma associated with that, right? Um, but to have a safe place to process the self is really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. It's the number one therapeutic thing we do, right? And so, and as you bring up CPTSD, I do think it's important for therapists because, religious trauma syndrome was coined by Marlene Winnell decades
Hmm.
ago. Wasn't taken very seriously at first. In fact, I was even one of those counselors that was like, "What?" you know. But we're having more and more research really support it. You're not going to find it in the DSM under religious trauma syndrome, but it does when you start really looking at the CPTSD criteria, it does fit that. So people can get diagnosed with PTSD, which is actually very helpful, especially in states where maybe there's medical marijuana or ketamine treatments or,
Hmm.
or just to help with whatever treatment assessing you're going to do to take a trauma-informed lens towards some of these issues that people are presenting with. So that's where, correct assessment and diagnosis is so important when it comes to this as well, is to help people have the resources they need. I haven't had this happen a whole lot, but I've even done some disability paperwork for people with CPTSD due to religious trauma.
Yeah, that's important to know. Like, it is a thing, and then, like all traumas, it's a spectrum, and
Yes.
every situation's unique. And just because you don't necessarily feel like you're worthy of calling it trauma doesn't mean it's not trauma.
Yeah,
So I
right.
think a lot of
And
people
that's
have
where
a
I
hard
don't,
time
yeah.
accepting. Yeah.
And that's where I don't want therapists, secular therapists, to be like, oh, that's just a religious thing. That doesn't sound like that would fit into the trauma sphere. And this is why it's important that we educate ourselves about how this definitely can fit under the CPTSD
Right.
umbrella.
Like anything that affects our sense of identity, our sense of security in the world, right? I mean, it doesn't get much more personal than our value system.
Yeah,
That
right,
really, I mean, talk about a shortcut to the subconscious,
right, right.
That's it. Um, so you got into this work because you had a deeply personal experience yourself. Did you want to share a little bit about that? No pressure.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm fine I don't mind talking about myself. That's that's fine. But yes, I definitely went through a very personal, raw experience back in 2021. So, where I was excommunicated from my church. So that was a formal process where the church decided that they were going to discipline me and punish me by basically removing my membership from the church that I have been a member of my whole life.
Mm.
My parents were converts when I was about 5 years old. I remember kind of the LDS missionaries coming to my door and everything. So it's been pretty much everything I can remember. And about, let's see, I want to say about 2012-ish, I want to say I started blogging. I
Hmm.
started writing. I started being more public about positions. I wrote a blog called The Mormon Therapist. It was kind of supposed to be a Dear Abby, but for
Oh,
Mormons.
right.
So they
That's
were,
cool. Yeah,
like
very cool.
right in it. And I thought I was going to get questions on parenting, like my teenager doesn't want to go to church, and what should I do? Or
Hmm.
my spouse has different religious ideas than I do, marital issues.
Hmm.
And guess what happens when you make an avenue open for anonymous questions? Well, about 80% of them were about sex
Mm.
and sexuality, right? Like, is it okay for me and my husband or wife to have oral sex? Is it okay
Hmm.
for us to have anal sex? Is it okay for, what should I do with all this guilt for the premarital sex I had? So lots and lots of sexual questions, which is what got me interested in getting my certification as a sex therapist. Because at first I was like, oh, yeah, sure, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I know something about sex. And then the more in-depth the questions got, I was like, I didn't really get a whole lot of training in sex. And that's another area,
Right.
right? We just don't get a lot of training in. If we get one course in our master's degree, that's actually good. There's
Hmm.
some that don't offer anything. So I went through AASECT and got my certification, which is a big process itself. Um, and so I started advocating. I started talking about, why do we make young people feel badly about touching their own bodies? Couldn't we use masturbation and self-touch and self-exploration as actually powerful tools to help them prepare for marriage and successful sex, and also having
Hmm.
boundaries in their teenager,
Hmm.
land? Like, if you always know you can come home to yourself and take care of yourself, you might not be as pressured, by other kids to have sexual experiences maybe before you're ready, or before that go against your own religious values, etc. So
Hmm.
I started kind of pushing the envelope on things like that. The next envelope I pushed was gay rights. What are
Hmm.
we going to do about our gay members? And treating them
Right.
like second-class citizens is not going to work. And we're having really, really tragic consequences when we do this. Like there's blood on our hands, church, when
Hmm.
because we know that non-affirming spaces will raise the rates of suicidality and many
For
other
sure.
mental health
That's exactly what I was
symptoms,
thinking. Yeah, it's a
including
huge
risky sex, including STIs,
problem.
including substance abuse.
Yeah.
Like, so many ways people try to cope when they're rejected by something as important as their church community for something that is, just part of who they are as a human being. So I started talking about supporting gay marriage and supporting our LGBTQ members, including our transgender members, which we're still having a big fight about right now in the United States, as you can see with so much legislation. So that was another button I was pushing. I also pushed the button on pornography that
Hmm.
a lot of these conservative churches will really push the sex addiction model and send everybody to sex addiction treatments. And it doesn't even matter whether you're watching porn once a year or twice a day. You're a sex addict. There's like no spectruming. And I saw this in
Hmm.
evangelical Wichita as well. And I did so much research and so much trying to figure out how can we help people with these dilemmas. And a lot of times it's not that it's out of control sexual behavior, it's just that the sexual behavior goes against your religious values. So I started speaking up that this addiction model is not effective. It's not even clinically researched. It's not seen as a correct treatment approach. And I got a lot of pushback from that, and not just from the Mormon community, but from the CSAT community and things like that. So I pushed on that, and then I became a mama dragon. I had a child come out as a non-binary child, so that was becoming personal as well.
Hmm.
So I would write and I would speak and I would, try to be respectful as I would do that, but I would call out what I felt were non-clinical
Sure.
supported positions that the church was taking that was actually harming our members. So in 2021, they let me do that actually for quite a while. I mean, I started this work, like I said, in 2012. So it was almost a decade later before they said, we're not going to allow you to talk like this anymore. And we're going to double down and excommunicate you, which is an interesting process in the Mormon community.
Yeah, please tell
Um,
him. I mean, I've heard about it, but I don't know the inner workings of what that looks like.
yeah,
It
and
could be
it's
helpful for all of us as therapists, because when somebody says I was excommunicated, we can just think, oh,
right.
okay, you're kicked out. But what is that experience like?
Yeah, so the
When you're cut off.
experience is that you're called in front of, um, leaders in the church, and they've made a few changes to this in the last, oh, I don't know, maybe 5 years to make it maybe a little bit less punitive, but typically it's at least 4 men that are going to be in the room with you, so the bishopric and the secretary person, or it's gonna be the entire high council, depending. Usually, if you're a man, it's taken more seriously than if you're a woman. There's gender issues there. So sometimes the women get the lesser amount of men in the room. But depending also on the sin, right? That you
Mm.
could have like a larger audience there. And if you have the whole high council, that's like 15 men and you by yourself, right? So
Now,
there's a
is this
huge
high council
power
from your home
differential.
church, or is there like a district church or something?
Yeah, so the high council is more like a district. It's kinda like the whole so in the Mormon world, we have congregations that are considered wards.
Hmm.
Wards is the name of them. And then I think about, like, maybe 7 to 10 wards consist of a stake, which is more like a diocese, if that makes sense
Mm,
from a
that
Catholic
makes more sense. Yeah.
perspective. And so those stake leaders would be the ones, 15 from there would come in and do so you come forward and you're tried. It's like a trial.
Mm.
They kind of even use, like legal language, like it's it's a court. They try to say, well, it's a court of love. I'm like, I don't think anybody would agree with that who's been through it, that it's a court
Hmm.
of love. And you present your case, and about the idea is that half of the men are supposed to be kind of representing you or being like advocates of you, and half of the men are representing the church, and that's the idea. But again, I've not really heard many people say, oh yeah, I came out of there feeling very represented. So
Hmm.
typically by the time you're in front of that space, something's going to happen. There's not usually much backing out at that point. So that's what I was invited to, was a court to come and defend my position. My particular situation went a little wonkier than normal, I think because they knew that it was somewhat public. And so
Hmm.
I didn't get really as much time or as much discussion. I tried to have conversations with these stake leaders before the court. Nobody really wanted to talk to me. So it was very upsetting. And basically you get a letter in the mail after that that says, you are no longer a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And for somebody who, from a religious standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, that has a lot of meaning, especially in my tradition where so many of um, the what we call ordinances, the ceremonies, like my
Hmm.
baptism, my sealing in the temple to my family, because Latter-day Saints believe that we can be sealed for time and all eternity. It's kind of like a marriage covenant, but for time and all eternity. It does not end at death. So my sealing to my family, my parents, my siblings, my marriage, which granted I'm divorced, and I was going through a divorce right at that time.
Mm.
However, even if we get worldly divorce, that sealing is still in place, and that affects my children and their capacity to be tied to me. So all of these ordinances that had, um, if not at least very symbolic meaning to me, are now null and void with that excommunication, right?
Mm.
So all of that is basically said you no longer have access to all of those ceremonies that you once participated in. So
Hmm.
it's a very, for me it was very distressing. First of all, to be treated in such a dismissive way, to be
Hmm.
treated in such a kind of cast aside type of
Disposable.
way,
Yeah.
to be treated kind of in a silencing way that, like, they wouldn't even listen really to me or to what I had to say. Um, yeah, it was traumatic. It was my own PTSD from that experience, and it
I
took
can
me
imagine.
months, if not, like, several years to, I would say, recover, and I don't know what recover means, always, but because it's still very tender to talk about, but, it will be, a very monumental moment in my life for the rest of my life. So that's part of the power that churches can wield on individuals' lives and cause a lot of havoc and sadness. And I got to experience it firsthand.
Yeah, because I mean, I would imagine, a large degree of attachment, not
Yeah,
just your lifestyle, but your
right. Your
actual
community,
psychological
it's your people.
attachment to that
Right,
community. And then you're
right.
told you can't have your community anymore. You can't have your
That's right.
family anymore. You can't participate. You're a black sheep.
It's a
Um,
shunning of sorts. I mean, the Amish
mhm.
community, like, they're considered a fundamental religion mainly because if you don't adhere, you're shunned. I mean, you're forcibly removed from the community. You cannot have contact with your family. I mean, I can still have contact with my family. I can even still go to the church if I wanted to. They're not gonna but I'm not gonna be able to participate. I'm not gonna be included. I'm not gonna be able to have any of the callings or responsibilities I once enjoyed, and I definitely don't have these blessings, that are considered
Mhm.
part of this ordinance work. So it is an informal shunning that happens. And as we know, when humans are shunned, that does not bode well for mental health.
Absolutely not. And especially for somebody who has a very strong faith and they're shunned, you know, that limits their options to practice, no?
Right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, as I talked to myself through this process, and I had shifted. I mean, I've been pretty honest that I was not necessarily a literal believer by the time that I was becoming excommunicated, but I was very much a symbolic believer, and I had
Hmm.
so much value and meaning in just my spirituality within the Mormon framework. And so as I was going through that process, I was like, well, they can't take that from me. They can't take my
Hmm.
spirituality from me. They can't take, these values and these ethics and these morals and just kind of everything that encapsulates meaning of life for me now. At the same time, I mean, you can say that to yourself all day long.
Yeah.
There's still this cost, and then this very intentional way to discredit you, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I'm a therapist in the community. I've helped so many people, mixed faith families,
Hmm.
people with perfectionism, people with scrupulosity, people with faith transitions, run of the mill mental health depression, just so many things. So you serve your community with all this love and you try to bring better things to it. Like, hey, maybe we don't have to harm so many people. Maybe there's some shifts or changes we can make. And as you do that, because I was coming with, of course, they have the priesthood authority. I was coming with my authority as a clinician, right? That's the authority I've been developing for 30 years.
Hmm.
And they say, no, not interested. Not only are we not interested, we're going to shun you and discredit you so that people within the community will not trust you as a therapist, right?
Right. Well, we haven't seen that to be the case because a lot of your clientele actually come, right?
Well, I think a
From,
lot of my clientele
yeah.
come because they're going through faith transitions and religious trauma, and they saw me go through that.
Hmm.
But the reality is that for a long time now, since I've been advocating, even before the church did anything to me, more Orthodox believers would have lost trust in me because I'm not touting the party line, right?
Hmm.
I'm not agreeing that masturbation is something we should be treating through a sexual addictions process.
Right. Right.
And so that's, I think, a dilemma that religious therapists are in is a lot of times I see religious therapists really acting like their religion is more like their code of ethics
Mm.
and their governing board than actually the licensing board and our actual association's codes of ethics, because they are complying with the churches and they are treating adolescents as sick because they masturbate. And that has no clinical basis, but there's lots of therapists who are doing that, or conversion therapists, right?
Hmm.
Or
Hmm.
and so these are therapists who are much more aligned with their religion and will treat things clinically that they see as quote unquote sick because the religion deems it a sickness, not because it's in the DSM or ICD.
Yeah. So how can we as therapists safeguard against implicit bias, right? From accidentally judging or operating off of a bias to our faith, if that's the case, because that can be tricky, right? I mean, that can be tricky sometimes when we hold certain belief systems. How can we safeguard against ourselves from that danger, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I hope that it's a question we're all asking ourselves on the
Hmm.
regular is what is
Yeah.
my current bias and in what areas? And this is why I think ongoing CEs, ongoing consultations, ongoing networking with other professionals, listening to programs like this are so important. But you can't just do that with people that sit in your same confirmation bias, right? Like
Mm.
you have to be willing to listen to other perspectives. There may be a lot of Latter-day Saint professionals here, for example. There's even associations, like there's the Christian Counseling Association. There's AMCAP, which I think is Association for Mormon Counselors and Professionals. Well,
Hmm.
if all you do is gather with other people who are like-minded, you're going to miss all those blind spots, right? That you really need to be looking at. And it's also very common, like I said before, for secular therapists to have a lot of negative implications about religion. Freud was not a fan of
No.
religion, right? He thought it was like ridiculous and infantile and kept people in kind of developmental spaces that were not healthy, which you may or may not agree with. That's okay. But how does that show up with the clients that are in front of you?
Right.
Because you can have clients where this is an integral part of their life. And if you're dismissing their religion like it's silly, that's definitely not going to bode for the therapeutic relationship. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. So definitely important to meet clients where they're at, right? To try not to make any assumptions, and ask the questions, try and understand the best we can about their experiences, right?
yes.
And this is crucial for deconstructing shame in general, right? Deconstructing sexual shame, religious trauma, all of these things, right?
Yeah, and I would say, obviously, this is what we do in therapy anyway, but
Hmm.
you meet people where you're at, where they're at, and then from that space, you hopefully are able to provide soft challenges, right? So not harsh, not rigid, not overly biased, but more like, where did you hear that from? And how's that showing up? And is that useful or not? And why or why not? And would it be possible for you to consider, these different thoughts? Like, here's 4 other ways we might be able to look at this, or any of those possibilities for you or not. Because I don't think as therapists we just should meet people where they're at, especially if they're in unhealthy places. I mean,
Good
there's
point.
people who
Yeah.
belong in cults, there's people who belong to, I do think some of these practices are not helpful in religion. And so
Hmm.
how can we show up in a compassionate space where we don't necessarily feel like we know better than, but we're able to offer a different perspective and
Ah,
just see whether or not that person might be open to that.
excellent. Which begs the question, for those who are struggling with sexual authenticity or religious trauma, or they're questioning whether the way they've been doing life, right, is in alignment with who they are, their values. What advice would you give to those people seeking recovery, seeking healing? Like, what are some initial steps, do you think, or some words of wisdom would be
Yeah, well, I
helpful?
think the first thing is finding an appropriate therapist, and that can be challenging. You don't necessarily want somebody who knows nothing about these topics. You don't necessarily want a religious therapist who's going to make you feel badly about leaving the faith, which I've heard some horror stories on.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily want a secular therapist either if they're not going to be like taking your dilemma seriously, right? So finding the right therapist is really important. Advocating for yourself in that journey is important because, again, if you're coming from a high demand religion, you are used to external authority telling you what to do. Right? You've got a religious leader, you've got God, you've got your parents. It's all very structured as far as like authority.
Hmm.
And a therapist can fall right back into that. You might look to this therapist now to be your new authority, and we're
Hmm.
really wanting to stretch that internal authority muscle. So even as
Right.
a therapist myself, a lot of times I'm like, oh yeah, I just gave that great idea, and they accepted it so readily, and I'm all happy. And then I'm like,
Ah,
maybe they accepted it too readily.
wow, that is such a
am
good
I,
point.
am
Yeah.
I becoming the
Yeah.
new authority in their lives, which
Right.
I don't want to be. I want to help them be their own authority. So that's one thing to look out for. It doesn't, and there's so many different modalities. I mean, whether it's EMDR or internal family systems or EFT, emotionally focused therapy, or Bowenian family system. And there's so many wonderful, beautiful theoretical framings. I think they can all do good work in this area. I don't know that you need one particular style of therapy. Even psychodrama can be quite fascinating to do religious
Sure
trauma
can.
through, so that worries me less than the actual capacity of the therapist to hold space for your experience,
Mm.
and to not just become your new authority. There's going to have to be a lot of grief work, acceptance work, boundaries work. Boy, do we need help
Mm.
boundaries in this population, right? Because we were taught to just say yes.
Give away our power.
Time,
Yeah.
right? Give away your time, give away your money, give away your talents, right? And so to be able to say no, or to be able to say an intentional yes, and also to be able to maybe still have relationships with people who are in the church, those can be very challenging things to know how to do. And boundary work will be very helpful in that regard.
Wow. Thank you. Such wonderful words of wisdom. And I think that was a great point I hadn't thought about. Being careful that we don't allow ourselves to become the quote new authority, right? Because
Right.
we're trying to instill a sense of locus of internal control, like the ability to use their own discernment to make decisions for their best own benefit, right?
Yes.
And not
Right.
to again not to defer to other people all the time because they don't feel safe with trusting themselves, right?
Yes. Right.
So.
And if you're gonna work on sexuality in particular, AASECT is a great resource, asect.org, where there's like a therapist directory, so you can find somebody who's actually been trained in sexuality. Because even with my couples who are interested in non-monogamy or kink, we'll get run-of-the-mill therapists who are not necessarily religious themselves, but still have this idea that this is like deviant behavior, or must mean that there must be an attachment disorder or commitment issue.
Mm.
And I'm like, that is not appropriate sex therapy, right? And so that's a whole nother area, is
Hmm.
finding somebody who is going to take a sex positive, sex affirming, and sex educated approach to your sexual healing.
Well, thank you so much, Natasha. Wonderful resources, great points. And for those who want to learn more about integrating religion and an understanding of the impact on clients and how to better assess for those dynamics and be more culturally aware, right? You have a great resource there you put together, learningreligiontherapy.com, right? So thank you for
Yes.
that. For those who want to learn more about the other work you're doing, you have a wonderful practice, right, going on. Symmetry Solutions, correct?
Yes. Yes,
Wonderful.
these are all providers who are trained under me on all these issues. We offer groups on religious trauma and reclaiming female sexuality, addressing male sexual shame for those who've been through these addiction programs and need to heal from that. So we offer a lot of these services, mixed orientation, marriage support. In fact, I'm starting a religious trauma group now in January, and I even invite therapists who have gone through their
Mm-hmm.
own transitions to attend, and then they can learn kind of my tools and use them with their clients. So,
How
yeah,
wonderful.
feel free to join me.
Are your groups remote?
They're all remote.
Wonderful.
Yes, so you can join me from anywhere, and they're educational support groups. They're
Mm-hmm.
not like classic therapy groups, so we
Oh,
can,
great.
meet
Wonderful.
across state lines and just offer a lot of education and resources that way.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And something we have failed to mention thus far is you have your own podcast, right?
Yes, I do. If you're okay
So
with that, I'll
I
share this one on there.
please, please do. Yes, please. By all means, I'll send you the audio and files and everything and
Yeah,
spread
perfect.
the wisdom. Um, you're always welcome back on, Natasha, if there's, want to let us know how things are coming along, if you want to let us pick your brain a little bit more on some more talk around sexual trauma or mixed faiths and relationships, marriages, and how we can navigate those dynamics. And anyone listening and watching, let us know, if you want Natasha back on for some more questions. And I know Monday mornings are a little hectic for you all to join us, but hey, it's when I have time. So that's how we roll.
Yeah, no, I love to like I say here, I love to talk about sex, religion, and everything in between, and I could talk for hours, so anytime you want me back on, just let me know.
Sounds good. This is your Facebook. We'll link up to all your socials, of course, in the show notes. And yeah, make sure you're easy to find, okay?
Okay.
All right. Before we call it, does anyone who's watching have any quick rapid fire questions? Otherwise, we'll have to save it for another day. Going once, going twice. All right. We'll save it for another time. Well, thank you, Natasha. I appreciate you being on. I will let you know when everything's posted and ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was lovely to
My
meet you,
pleasure.
Patrick.
Likewise. Do be sure to stick around in the studio so all the audio recordings, everything go up, and then I'll check you out in just a minute.
Okay,
Okay?
sounds good.
Sounds good.